Good evening, good evening, good evening. My name is Sharon Stroy. I currently serve as the Director of Public Engagement in the School of Public Affairs Administration, the Director for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Center at Rutgers University, Newark, and I will serve as your host and moderator this evening. However, before I begin, I must take a moment to acknowledge the land that I am physically located on. I begin this event with the acknowledgement that I am not an Indigenous person, and I want to pay homage to the original inhabitants of this land. We gather today from many locations, but for those individuals physically located in New Jersey, where Rutgers University, Newark is located, we acknowledge that we are in the traditional territory of the Lenni Lenape, the indigenous people of the land. We honor the Lenape tribal communities that still remain in their homeland and those of the diaspora that were forced to migrate away. We respectfully acknowledge that from ancient times, the Lenape and other indigenous tribes have relationship with the lands and waters across this country, and we pause to show our respect for their ancestors who lived here before, the indigenous people today, and their generations to come. Thank you. I am so excited to be here with you tonight. On behalf of the Black Organization of Students Alumni Association, the sponsor for tonight's event, we want to welcome you to the first event in the series of events to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the creation of the Newark campus of Rutgers University. Members of the Black Organization of Students Alumni Association are integral and telling the birth and rebirth story of Rutgers Newark. Their mission is providing mentorship to the current BOSAA student organization, share the stories of all Rutgers Newark alumni of African descent, and preserving the legacy of BOSAA in Newark and throughout the Rutgers University system. Please follow them on Facebook and Twitter. I want to extend a personal token of appreciation for those members who have opened doors, who have cleared paths for me to be here with you tonight. I also want to give thanks to the staff and logistical team in the Rutgers University Alumni Association and the Rutgers University Foundation for bringing this event to life. It is my pleasure this evening to present Quintus Jett, our presenter and discussion for tonight. I'm grateful to Quintus for asking me to moderate. Let me tell you why. As a daughter born and raised from the city of Newark, as a proud member of the Newark Public School System, University High, the first class to graduate from the Clinton Place location, as a 20-year employee of Rutgers University, Newark, trained by some of the best and the brightest. And as a double alum of Rutgers University, Newark with an MPA and an MBA degree, it is my absolute pleasure to engage this discussion about the birth of Rutgers University, Newark. But I'm also an amateur historian, a little bit, but I like history. You know, there are days when I drive my 84-year-old mother through the city of Newark. I would share stories about the many places I've been. I think I've covered every inch of this city, from the East Ward to the North Ward to the South Ward. Growing up, I spent so much time just going throughout the entire city that I still call it home. I have spent time in at least 3 of the 5 movie theaters in downtown Newark when I was growing up. The Newark Museum and the Newark Public Library was a standard and a hangout. Imagine that, the library and the museum. I covered the entire city, but I did not enter the walls of Rutgers University, Newark until 2001, when I was the director of the Rutgers University, Newark Upper Bound program, a program to help high school students enter and persist in a post-secondary education. It was the education that I got from University High that said that I could go to college. As a first-generation low-income student, I know personally how important an education can be. But it was also at that time in 2001 that I developed an interest in the history of the place I call home, and the place that I have called home for the last 20 years. It was where I found out that the New Jersey College of Pharmacy, the New Jersey Law School, the Newark Institute of Arts and Sciences, the Mercer Beasley School of Law, the Seth Boyden School of Business, and Dana College, all institutions located in the city of Newark from the late 1800s to 1936. It was these institutions that became the University of Newark in 1936. In 1946, the University of Newark and the New Jersey College of Pharmacy became the Newark Colleges of Rutgers University. The interesting thing is that how many people know this story? And my question to you tonight, did you know that story? So before we begin, let me share a few housekeeping reminders. We will have a presentation from Dr. Jett. I do have a few prepared questions for him. We were fortunate to have questions submitted to us from the audience. Please note all attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of this discussion. If you have any questions, please send them via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. The chat function has been disabled. Following the discussion, I will read your questions aloud to our panel, and then we will take as many questions as possible. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Quintus Jett. Dr. Quintus Jett received his PhD in organizations from Stanford University School of Engineering, specializing in the management of innovation and the strategies of high-tech terms. He is an innovator in higher education, bringing divides between academic research and the other priorities of the modern university, including student access, diversity, community engagement, and providing foundations for lifelong learning in today's rapidly changing world. He has a faculty career which spans business at Rice University, engineering at Dartmouth College, public administration at the School of Public Affairs and Administration. In addition to his time at Rutgers University, Newark, Dr. Jett has been affiliated with the Rutgers Business School Center for Urban Entrepreneurship and Economic Development. Dr. Jett is a cross-disciplinary management scholar who translates between theory and applications to empower community and faith-based organizations and innovators. He has particular expertise in organizing from the bottom up, which has growing potency in network societies that have extensive adoption and use of smart mobile devices and internet. He also has expertise with enterprising nonprofits, specifically those that seek to employ management science techniques to inform strategy, choreograph operations, and grow capacity through digital technologies. Before his academic career, Dr. Jett was a member of the technical staff at NASA's Caltech Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He holds a master's degree in industrial engineering from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in systems science and engineering from the University of Pennsylvania. It was during his time when Dr. Jett served as the director for Citizen Lum, a special project in the Rutgers University Office of Chancellor Advancement Team, where his unabashed passion, research, and interest in the origin story of Rutgers University Newark began. Please join me in my pleasure to introduce our presenter for this evening, Dr. Quintus Jett.
All right, thank you, Sharon. To begin, I think if we're going to talk about the origin story of Rutgers University Newark, I think we have to sort of take our minds back a bit. So imagine it's over 50 years ago. It's 1969. It's a winter morning, and a large group of students, like 24, have arrived at Conklin Hall, the center of campus. It's important to think about the context to this. the city of Newark is a majority Black at this point. And about a year before was the Newark uprising. And so given that context, Rutgers Newark, is it as diverse as the city? No, it is not. In fact, this is very much a predominantly white space. So a large group of Black students are showing up and they go inside. This is a risky proposition. So of course, this was not done on a whim. They had plans of what they were going to do. They came in, they secured the various entries into the building, barricaded them, put out the security guard, and more importantly, they had a set of demands. Again, this was not any kind of a whim. The Black Organization of Students had worked with the university for over a year to get change. Considering, again, how many students outside of the, how many students were not Black on campus. So they even would, the university said, oh, well, we can't find Black students to admit. And that students, BSO, went out and actually brought people to apply. So in a way, I'd like to think or imagine that they had had enough. And those who did participate in it were brave, because not all of the Black students there were willing to take that risk to initiate change. I bring that up because that is really a birth moment for Rutgers University, Newark. It's and especially when you look at like from that moment to what it's become now. So right now we embrace certain things about this institution. We embrace that it's not just simply in Newark, that it's of Newark, that it works with the community. It's actively seeking to work with the community. We embrace the fact that it provides educational access to those who otherwise wouldn't have it. We embrace how there is such diversity in this institution that I was on the outside of John Conley Dana Library earlier, and the diversity is incredible. This is the most diverse university in this country. And what that means is no matter what background you are, the chances of you running into someone who's not from your background is actually very high. And then there's another layer. We actually have a moment in time where we have leadership, Chancellor Nancy Cantor, who invokes democracy in relation to American higher education, but also in terms of this institution. So in a lot of ways, it's like, think of it this way. Universities are a public good. It's not something just for individuals to just develop their skills, that their university provides education and an opportunity for students to demonstrate their civic responsibility. So that is who we are today. But it turns out that this institution had all these elements that I'm sort of describing before 75 years ago, when it became Rutgers Newark. And when you look at the context of that time, things look a little bit different. Yes, the liberation of Conklin Hall was a birth moment, but I'm going to hopefully convince you that it was also a rebirth moment, a rebirth that can lead to an uncovering of an illustrious legacy of the University of Newark that existed and ended with the institution ended with 1946, 75 years ago. So I want to introduce you to someone. So this is Louise Bullock. I discovered her in the Encore yearbook of the class of 1937. You see on the right, the seal of the University of Newark. The University of Newark had a motto. Its motto, whatsoever things are true. Some of you may recognize from the Bible. And so when I came across Louise Bullock, I had some questions, and I may ask you, I mean, does she look African-American to you? Well, she kind of did to me. And I wanted to sort of investigate that. And so fortunately, back in the days of the yearbooks, they did list the home addresses of the students. And so I proceeded to look up in the census who was living at that address. And there was indeed a Bullock family in Montclair, New Jersey. And there's a whole household of Bullocks in the house. The thing is, there wasn't a Louise. There wasn't a Louise in there. There was a Lewis who was about the same age. But I decided to go a little bit further with that. And the head of the household was someone named Charles H. Bullock. And it turns out that there's a Charles H. Bullock name associated with Montclair today. If some of you who know Montclair, or you can look it up, there's a Charles H. Bullock school in Montclair today. And that school is named after Louise's father. Louise is the baby daughter of Charles H. Bullock. Charles H. Bullock was a organizer for the Colored Men's YMCA. And he was an organizer. He was in Charlotte, Virginia, where Louise was born, and her siblings. He proceeded to organize and set up a chapter in Brooklyn. He had also done it in Kentucky, and then he kind of came to Montclair. So that's who Louise Bullock is. But I think it'd be useful to think about like what Louise may have seen. Like, we don't know like the full story, but we do know some things. And basically about 85 years ago from today, Louise Bullock would have been a senior at the University of Newark. And what kind of university would she, or what kind of experience did she have? Well, one thing is she commuted. There's a lot of other evidence to show that most students at University of Newark were commuters in a way somewhat like today. This picture here is from the yearbook of Encore from 1937. The big circle is the location of the University of Newark on 40 Rector Street. Rector Street, not sure if you can see, but on my right-hand side down, there's a road. It's a road that's right behind Military Park. That's Rector Street. And so that's where the University of Newark was. It later became like the old Science High, but now it's they've actually just redone it into something else. And so there's Rector Street. The small circle is where I'm at now. I'm in the Haynes building where the Whole Foods is. I'd say about 200 feet to my right is a building called the Griffith Building that you may or may not have noticed, but it's large and it's vacant, and it refers to a great piano magnate, Parker Griffith. And you can see this is very close to, like, further down in the map, you can see Washington Street, and so where our campus is. So she was frequenting this area. And actually, as a small aside, I mean, it appears that McGovern's on New Street, I mean, apparently law students have been attending McGovern's since before we were Rutgers. That's how far back it is in this area. And so most of the students at the University of Newark were living or working in Newark. A lot of them were employed. It was to the point where there would actually be day classes and evening classes, because some of the students worked during the day, and they could only take classes at night, again, because they were working full or part-time while they were going to school, which may be familiar to some of you current students and alumni. And also too, the students were, it was inclusive. So the University of Newark in the 1930s had men and women in classes together. And a lot of the students were children of immigrants. And based off of some of there were studies at the time, a lot of the students were either, about 40% of the students were Jewish. And mostly all the students were from, if not Newark, they were from like little towns like nearby, like sort of like Elizabeth or Montclair in Louise Bullock's case. A good question might be like, how did Louise end up here? I did manage to meet and get to know the family historian for the Bullock family, and that helped answer some questions. It turns out that Louis Bullock was Louise's twin brother. And so here's a picture from her of her from her family. And one question would be, how did Louise end up at the University of Newark, given that the creation of the University of Newark completed in 1936? She's in the class of 37. What happened? Did she kind of come in, come in the last 2 years? Did she, or what of the feeder institutions that made the University of Newark did she come from? I mean, did she come from the Newark Institute? Did she come from Newark Beasley Law School? Did she, or was she from the other group? Was she from Dana College or the Seth Boyden School of Business or the New Jersey Law School? I came upon evidence that she was indeed from Dana College. I can't really say that I looked for it and found it, but I came across a bulletin of Dana College back from the early mid 30s, and I can see Louise's name. She's listed as a freshman and in the day school. And so this is I put a quote from a Dana College promotional program. And so this gives you an idea of what kind of world she was looking to enter by starting with Dana College and going to the University of Newark. Dana College was a place, note, for men and women, and this is the 1930s, a place to really place your own social responsibility ahead of just your own personal interests. So, and these are the words that Dana College would use: public service. So in a sense, a lot of what we do today when we talk about public service, we are today in the present day at Rutgers University, Newark, we are in fact invoking, in some ways, a legacy and tradition that's been going on for a very long time. So right here, you're looking at the cover of a pamphlet that was done in 1938 when the University of Newark was looking to raise money. And so it's a very good snapshot about who they were and what they sought to be. And so I just took a couple of excerpts. One, they actually talked about what is the University of Newark going to do for the region for New Jersey and at large, more than just Newark, at large. And it talks about helping to train and alert citizenry, from building up, the civic electorate from the bottom up. Maybe to put this in context, think about what was going on in the 1930s. In the 1930s, Hitler was on the march in Germany. There was a concern about fascism. There was concern about propaganda. And there was actually some concern about the future of American democracy in the 1930s. And so there's quite a few documentation of the University of Newark leadership explicitly saying that democracy was at the core of preparing the citizenry in a democratic sense, was very much a part of what they were doing. So much so that the first president of the University of Newark, Reverend Dr. Frank Kingdon, he was notified or asked his opinion when a number of University of Newark students were in Military Park protesting. And they say, or should you be concerned about this and how this takes away from their studies? And Dr. Kingdon kind of responded, well, no, this is all part of it. This is all part of the educational experience at University of Newark. It's not just what happens in the books, but also what happens in the community engagement. For individuals, they said how they supplied opportunity without regard to race, creed, or color for young men and women from lower and middle income levels, qualified to profit from higher education, but also to benefit society from their training. So I think it would be a reach to say, there weren't a lot of let's say, Black students at the University of Newark, but I think in the 1938, to basically be this forward that no, we are inclusive, really does say something. And this document was published by the Women's Committee of the University of Newark Fund Development Campaign, and the chairman was Mrs. Parker O'Griffith. That's the spouse of Parker O'Griffith. Her name is Lena Griffith, and so yes, so that's why the Griffith Building actually does play a role in the history of this institution. So I have two photos here of Louise Bullock, again, for courtesy of the family historian. and Beatrice Windsor. Beatrice Windsor is often referred to with John Cotton Dana. John Cotton Dana is famous as a librarian and also for starting the Newark Museum. But Beatrice Windsor was his assistant director the whole time. And then John Cotton Dana passed away in 1929. And Beatrice Windsor herself became the director of both the library and the Newark Museum, just like Dana. And she kept the programs alive and thriving through the 1930s and the Depression. It turns out that when it comes to, like, for myself discovering the life of the University of Newark, a lot of it comes right through Beatrice Windsor. Like, most of the materials I found weren't actually within Rutgers. Most of it was elsewhere. It's only recently that Rutgers Newark has its own archivist, like the past 2 years. But Beatrice Windsor was very active behind the scenes. There's evidence of students like reaching out to her for assistance for various things, like the editor of the newspaper, of the Observer. And they come together in 1937 because that's when Louise Bullock graduated from the University of Newark with a bachelor's degree in psychology. And that was also the year that Beatrice Windsor received an honorary degree from the University of Newark because of her contributions. Because she was a trustee, and she was also one of the many civic leaders that were a part of the University of Newark. Quick aside, because of both of them are from the same year, I've actually seen commencement programs from both of them, from the Bullock family, and I've seen it the identical one from Beatrice Windsor's effects. And what's really beautiful to see is Louise Bullock graduated from the College of Arts and Sciences, and she, you can see how many students were in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Newark in 1937. And when you look, there's about 34 students. And of those 34 students, 16 of them are women. And for the 1930s, that's really impressive. Yeah, so 16 of 34 students in the College of Arts and Sciences are women, and one of them is African-American. So I think in sort of like closing remarks, we can get to questions. In the end, we really should be, maybe I'm calling on all of us to think more and embrace the Newark legacies within Rutgers. Dr. Clement Price, historian who unfortunately passed away in 2014, he would often say that all roads lead to Newark. And that was a way of talking about the centrality that Newark has. I mean, Newark remains still the largest city. And Jerry Eisenberg down below is a alum of Rutgers Newark from the late 40s, early 50s. I had a chance, he's a sports writer. He's actually covered lots of sports, including at Muhammad Ali. And so I had a chance to meet with him when he came on campus. And I was kind of curious what it was like those early years after the merger. And then he was the one who told me that among the students, they used to call themselves, instead of Rutgers Newark, they used to say, no, we call ourselves Newark Rutgers, because there was such Newark pride in the students that existed. The final picture here is just one of the outside scenes at the liberation of Conklin Hall. And so again, I want to come back to the original point that what the Black Organization of Students did in 1969 was very powerful, because here we had an institution that was born like before the merger to do things like be an anchor institution to the city of Newark, to provide educational access inclusively, and to represent and reflect and build like citizens. That's what it was before the merger. And most of the students before the merger, there was a representation of people from the city. But then it's like by 1969, as the city of Newark was predominantly Black and Rutgers Newark wasn't, in some way, yes, the institution had failed on its own ideals. And so what we really owe a debt of gratitude for the Black Organization of Students for is shaking up this institution to live up to what it was born to be, which is this community engaged, inclusive place for students, and and almost uplifting, not just in terms of individuals, but in terms of personal responsibility, et cetera. So I'm just going to leave this. These are the variety of places that the sources that I came across. Harold Wessler is a pretty prominent historian for studying American higher education, and so he does talk about the history of the University of Newark itself, how it got started in 1908, the earliest one with the New Jersey Law School, and how it became University of Newark. And then there's a variety of places that were the source of the history. And I put down Angela Lawrence. She's the new archivist. So it's great that there finally is, since 2019, a place for people to engage in terms of discovering even more of the Rutgers Newark histories. So with that, I'm going to stop. And I want to thank the Black Organization of Students Alumni Association for this opportunity.
Thank you, Quintus. Your presentation was enlightening. Interesting enough, a side note, as I've seen this picture of the liberation of Conklin Hall many, many times. I don't think I've ever paid attention to the sign where it said Black Student Organization of Bloomfield College supports Rutgers, the students at Rutgers University, Newark. And as someone who graduated from Bloomfield College with their undergraduate degree, it was nice to know that I was at an institution that even then was supporting the liberation of Conklin Hall. So at this time, if you have any questions, audience, please feel free to put it in the Q&A. But I do have a couple of questions that were already submitted. Quintus, you touched on it briefly in your remarks. Did the institutions have a significant number of African Americans before the merger? In your research, did you find that they had other African American students in some of the other institutions outside of Louise Bullock?
So far, I really haven't seen many. There was evidence of at Dana College, there was a Black male who had graduated, who had a career in law. And Louise Bullock appears to be the first African-American woman, but that's the thing, we have to look like further. And also I should add too, it's like she graduated in 1937. I think currently Rutgers acknowledges the first African-American woman were graduated in 1938. And so yeah, Louise Bullock is one of the earliest, if not the earliest, African-American woman within the Rutgers legacies.
So when we think about the city, thank you, Quintus. When we think about the city of Newark, New Jersey, there are a number of historical names. The Freelandheisen family, Seth Boyden, and the recently discovered part of history of Frederick Douglass, who gave a speech at the Plain Street Colored Church, which is now on the location of the Rutgers athletic field. And in 2019, that field was changed, the name of the field was changed to the Frederick Douglass Field. Can you elaborate on the significance of John Cotton Dana, specifically since our library is named after him?
And people apparently were so inspired by him and this vision that John Cotton Dana died in 1929. And then Dana College, that got named after him. And Beatrice Windsor definitely did a lot to help make sure everyone knew about John Cotton Dana. John Cotton Dana is probably one of the country's most renowned public librarians. He was big on community engagement, like having materials, let's say for children in the library in different languages for immigrants that were in the city of Newark. And so, I mean, Dana's mostly known for, librarians and museums, but in a lot of ways, a legacy of John Cotton Dana is also education. And I think this institution, frankly.
Quintus, I found it interesting that there are a number of individuals, faculty, staff, students that don't necessarily know this history for the University of Newark, which is now today Rutgers University, Newark. What do you attribute that to?
I've been wondering. I mean, it seemed like something happened in possibly the late 60s, early 70s, because when you look at the New York Times obituary of the first president of the University of Newark, Reverend Dr. Kingdon, it mentions all these things about him, and it mentions that he was the president of Newark University, but it doesn't mention that Newark University has become Rutgers Newark. It's missing, and it may be because there is evidence that the University of Newark leaders were were civic leaders, a lot of industrial people, like were civically engaged, people like Franklin Conklin, actually. And one of the dilemmas is they were very much ahead of their time. Reverend Dr. Kingdon, the first president, he was very outspoken against Nazis. Nazis in the 1930s, like before we went to war, he was outspoken against Nazis abroad, and he was outspoken about the Nazis that were in Newark. And he was also apparently spoke out against lynching too. So you almost wonder if it's like they were so outspoken that it's not there. And probably the clearest example is the John Cotton Dana connection. I mean, there was a John Cotton Dana library before the merger. And in fact, if you go to the alma mater song of Rutgers Newark, go to the second stanza of the second verse, and it begins, John Dana's dream of dear old Newark. And in a way that makes sense, right? It's like when the campus this campus as we know it got built in the late 60s, why would you put a library in the middle of that campus and call it John Cotton Dana? Yeah, because that meant something.
Right. Elaborate on for our audience, who is Franklin Conklin?
What I know about Franklin Conklin is he was one of the civic leaders that were very much engaged with the university. He was involved with one of the institutions with the merger, and he was like a local trustee, actually I think president of the Newark Museum at one point, and so he was very much involved in the institution actually before the merger. And if I'm remembering my dates right, I think he probably died like 2 or 3 years before. So the Conklin building might have been named probably like 2 or 3 years before the takeover happened.
But what it also says is we can also talk about the conversation of Hill Hall and Bessie Hill, who is an African-American woman that the building was named after her. So even at that time when it was called Hill Hall, it was ahead of its time. So how do we share this information with our students to reignite that Rutgers pride, that Newark pride? As a person, it's so interesting, as a resident, currently a resident of the city of Newark, born and raised in the city of Newark, no matter where I go in the country or in the world, when I come across people and they ask, well, where's home? And you say Newark, New Jersey, there's this feeling of nostalgia, this feeling of pride, and we all start reminiscing down that lane about how great the city was to us.
Yeah.
We're not going to say that the city didn't have problems and that people have not endured some things. But how do we reinstill that pride about being Rutgers University Newark?
One step I think involves Beatrice Windsor. John Cotton Dana was like more from an aristocratic family. His family goes back to the Mayflower. He's born in Vermont. He went to Dartmouth. Beatrice Windsor was born in Newark. And though she did grow up, like her father was a Civil War correspondent for New York Times. And her father was born in Bermuda as well. She actually, her first language was German, not English. And she spent a whole career in the Newark Public Library. I mean, she worked her way up to being the assistant director in her late 20s. And probably one of the reasons she didn't get to be the director was because they didn't want to put a woman in charge. So for me, based on the things I've seen that Beatrice Windsor was behind and doing in terms of fundraising, in terms of the University of Newark diplomas, and from a prestigious publisher, I think a lot of it comes to her. First thing I would do is elevate her. I think we should be celebrating Beatrice Windsor in some form. Every her birthday's in March. Like every March, there should be something that supports her. And then probably the second thing I think too is to go a bit deeper on who the population of students here are. There was a student there when I first accepted the faculty position here. Someone I knew who was very active in education, I said, "Oh, I'm going to Rutgers Newark." She's like, "Newark, like Rutgers Newark, right? Not New Brunswick, Newark." I'm like, yeah. And she goes, "I'm an alum of Rutgers Newark." I'm like, wow. And I was surprised because that my friend Tara is white, and so I'm like, huh? And so she basically explained to me, and it's been really helpful to see it. A lot of students at Rutgers Newark are first generation college students. You go to Harvard, it's like around the edges. Here, it's the main thing. There are a lot of students who are first generation college. A lot of students are first generation or second generation American, like their parent, at least one parent born outside the United States. That's one of those things that really unites us. So so I guess it's finding ways to embrace our non-traditionalness of the students. Most Rutgers Newark students, didn't have parents who went to college, who haven't been in America for a very long time, like for generations. A lot of Rutgers Newark students and alumni never lived on campus, and a lot didn't necessarily come, go from freshman year all the way 4 years. There are people who transferred in. I have at least another friend who she had dropped out of school to start a family, and then in her 20s she came back, and where she come? She came here. So I think it's like finding ways to embrace the stories that actually like our legacy and our tradition, and finding ways to embrace that like even more than what we do.
Awesome. I have another question from the audience. Can you emphasize the connections? And you did touch on this, but let's have a little deeper conversation as you quoted the rebirth.
Yeah.
Emphasize the connections between the liberation of Conklin Hall and the diversity of the enrolled students since that time until present. Because as you stated in your presentation, the diversity of the students has definitely drastically changed. What was the demographic of the student population? Yes, you stated predominantly white, but were there any other ethnicities and any other demographics at that time to where you look at Rutgers University Newark today, everybody from everywhere?
I think in terms of its time, I mean, there was a bit of that in the University of Newark. Again, admitting women, I mean, I think it's easy for us to forget now, because I think there were still separate women colleges in a lot of cases, I mean, until the 70s, so so I think that's usually where it shows up. And so in that sense, what the liberation of Conklin Hall did is it really appropriately called the institution out. Because I mean, Newark as a city changed its racial composition relatively quickly. It was like mostly all white, and then it was like pretty much like Black and Puerto Rican. and the institution was too slow and just wasn't making any progress on changing that. And so I mean, having that sort of diversity inclusion as a value, I mean, that's what we call it now, but that's really what I think what this the liberation of Conklin Hall was about. I mean, my understanding that the Puerto Rican organization of students, they took over Conklin Hall the month after. so yes, I think that's where it plays out. I mean, like having the inclusion of this area. So any university you go to, like you see, let's say, I think UC Irvine is also very diverse. Well, why? Well, it's because there are there's a lot of immigration into that area that's Asian and Latino. And so that's what's causing it. That's contributing to it. So it's like, in that sense, it shouldn't be that hard just to be as inclusive as your environment is. It shouldn't be that hard, but it can be. And I'm really glad that the Black Organization of Students right there appropriately called them on it. And they called it on it. They seriously, that series of demands, specifically the things they wanted changed, and they negotiated. And that's not to say everything was perfect after then, but at least as a value, having that as our beacon, as our shining star is something that's really very powerful. And again, this didn't just lead the way at Newark. This actually leads the way at the rest of the Rutgers system as well. I've taught in New Brunswick, and I taught a social entrepreneurship class, and I surveyed the students. Out of 50 students, there are 15 non-English languages spoken. And this is New Brunswick. New Brunswick has a lot of diversity as well.
Awesome. We do have a question from an audience member. They want to thank you. This amazing presentation. This history should be in the history curriculum for grade school students. What would you say about this great history being a 1 to 3 credit course required for all students, not just for college students, but also as the curriculum in the Newark Public Schools is changing to be more inclusive of Newark's history? What do you say about this being part of the curriculum?
I say yes. Yeah, because I think about Dr. Clement Price. Like the extensive history that he did about like the history of Newark is wonderful, and there's so much richness to it. And also as someone I've lived in Texas, and I've lived just over the border from Vermont. And what Texas and Vermont have in common is they take their state history very seriously. If you live in Texas, you're getting like some Texas history. If you live in Vermont, you're getting some Vermont history. Yeah, I think that's a great idea, that there should be Newark history for students who are in Newark, so they can actually feel the pride they should justifiably have for being from this city.
All right, another question, and you can answer it the best way you know how. How did the experience Rutgers in Newark change with the advent of the GI Bill?
I would say that in a way, I think of it almost like it's a trick question, because what's going on is that the GI Bill was after World War II had happened. So there was an enrollment issue like in the 40s and early 40s, definitely with the law school portion of the University of Newark. And so all of a sudden with the GI Bill in 1945 or so, all of a sudden, a lot of veterans are coming back. And so the enrollments, the early enrollments of Rutgers Newark could spring up because of the GI Bill. And I imagine the same thing happened in the Newark College of Engineering, which we now call NGIT, the GI Bill sent more people to school, which allowed higher education to expand.
The question is, sent more, who went to school? Because there were also the issues of the African-American soldiers who some of them did not benefit from the educational aspects of the GI Bill. So once again, the question becomes, yes, the GI Bill occurred and enrollment went up, but for what demographic?
For whom? Yeah, and the thing that gets me, that's been really interesting to me about this topic is there are just so many stories. I mean, even just the limited exposure that I have, there's so many stories and there's so many opportunities, I think, for other people to dig in for the research. Actually, an example, one of the people I saw in the yearbooks was someone named Jenny Liu. She looks like she's Asian. She was in the Seth Boyden School of Business in the Secretarial Studies. She shows up at the end, so it looks like she might have been part of a program, like not like a full degree, but something else. And I've looked her up, I looked up her family, because I mean, she was listed as living on Schuyler Avenue in Kearney. And it turns out that Jenny Liu is American-born Chinese. She was born in the United States. Her brothers were born in the United States in Virginia. Her parents were born in China. And so I haven't been able to find out whatever happened to her. But yeah, I mean, there are stories within stories that I think are worth looking into and unpacking.
And so, the importance of this is when we start actually listening to the stories, we recognize that we actually have more in common than we do different. And it is in our shared humanity through storytelling that maybe some of these other issues that we have going on currently can dissipate. When we recognize that if we actually, once again, for the greater good of society, education should not be that challenging to obtain. But here we go, and in those remarks, Nancy Cantor, when she came in with her leadership team, the phrase in Newark, we're not just in Newark, but we're of Newark. Yeah. What does that mean in 1946, and what does that mean today?
Well, that's a big question. I don't think I can fully answer that, but I do think that, I mean, it's a great question. I think the difference between then and now is that it's really important. I mean, I'm speaking now as an organization theorist. In order to get organizational change and transformation, you have to embrace who you are. I mean, organizations tend to have an imprint of what they were, and you have to work from that. And so it appears that the merger happened with the University of Newark and Rutgers, and all the illustrious things about the University of Newark either were not valued or prioritized, and so that they could just fade into memory. And it's like, well, no, we have to go back and really activate those things. I mean, I'm not sure if many alumni realize that, where did the Rutgers Law School and the Rutgers Business School come from? They were started in Newark as part of the University of Newark. So I think there is, so I think that's the difference. There's an opportunity, and there's the leadership that is being straightforward about the value that is Newark. And so I think that's the difference. It almost seems as if at the moment of the merger that perhaps who was leading the University of Newark, I'm not sure whether they didn't feel like they had a sense of empowerment about what themselves and their values. But again, organizations are very interesting that way. There's a saying that history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And it is quite amazing and remarkable. I mean, part of it was due to the charrettes that took place when Nancy Cantor came in, Cantor came in. But yeah, it's amazing that there are a lot of beautiful echoes of the tradition and of almost like the spiritual power of the institution. So in that sense, yeah, it's almost as if the Conklin Hall liberation, again, not just a birth, it was like a rebirth, but the beginnings of a resurrection. And now the institution is standing up and walking around. It's like, hey, okay, this is what we're about. this institution's been about this for more than 75 years. And so now it's all being uncovered and embraced.
Quintus, Jett, thank you, thank you, thank you. To the Black Organization Students Alumni Association, thank you for allowing me to moderate this discussion this evening. It has been an absolute pleasure. We want to thank the Rutgers University Alumni Association, Rutgers University Foundation for putting this event together. It has been an absolute pleasure. Please follow there will be other events recognizing the 75th anniversary of Rutgers University Newark. Everyone be safe. Have a great evening. Quintus, Jett, thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy.